That'll be okay.
Yeah. All right. I think I'm going to go ahead and start. And I will put the agenda in the chat one more time and screen share again to look at the agenda. Excuse me. And it's got the flyer at the top and the description for tonight's session, which we'll see how well we do on that. And then an instruction for you to start pondering this block of graphite, which I actually have the actual block that's a picture of in my hand here. And it'll actually be a little bit before we come back to that, but I want you to sort of plant that seed in the back of your mind. And I'll ask you to introduce yourself in the chat and say where you're from and what you do. I am Don Haas. I am the Director of Teacher Programming at the Paleontological Research Institution and its Museum of the Earth, which is in Ithaca, New York, though I've been telecommuting from near Buffalo for 15 years now. So before it was fashionable, I will ask my PRI colleagues to briefly introduce themselves as well. So Ingrid, do you want to say hello?
Sure. Hi, I'm Ingrid Zabel, grateful colleague of Don's, and I'm the Climate Change Education Manager at PRI.
And Rob, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Rob Ross. I'm Associate Director for Outreach at PRI, long-term colleagues of Don and Ingrid, and I know some of you.
Yes. And I'll note the fourth member of PRI's climate team is Alex Moore, who is in Paris at the moment, where it's, I think, going on midnight there. So she is not joining us tonight. And some of you I know have seen a version of this talk in the past. And so you know some of the surprises that lay in store for others. And what I've done for tonight is essentially created a teacher's edition of that talk, and hope it'll work. This is the first time I've given this new enhanced teacher's edition version. So we're going to go through the talk, Where Does Gasoline Go? And bring some more into it to sort of talk about the decisions made for why this is probably my favorite lesson that I've taught in my 35 years of teaching or something like that. I don't remember exactly how long it is, but it's a lot. It's a long time. And there's some flexibility in the agenda. So note that says possibly. So we'll see if we actually do that. I am going to switch over to Keynote, and I will also note that I prefer Keynote to PowerPoint because I think it's both prettier and easier to do some of the animations you'll see tonight. So there is that block of graphite. Here it is in my hand. And I want you to stick in the back of your mind how you think it compares. It is pure carbon. Graphite's pure carbon. As I like to note, I couldn't afford a chunk of diamond big enough to make the point, so I got graphite instead. And it's got a quarter in the picture there to show you scale, and I want you to think about how it compares to the amount of carbon in a gallon of gasoline. So is it a lot less, about the same, or a lot more? And we'll come back to that in a bit. And I'll ask my colleagues to let me know if there's something in the chat I ought to know about. So the title of the talk tonight is on 2x4s, graphite and gasoline, and it's really the teacher's edition of Where Does Gasoline Go? And I've inserted into it these strategy slides that are reversing the color scheme. So throughout the session tonight, I'm going to pause and discuss some of the strategies in more depth than I might in a typical class about climate change. I do generally pay some attention to that, even when I'm talking to kids, because I think everybody's a teacher, and hopefully people will carry the message forward and some of the strategies forward, regardless of if they're professional educators or avocational. And no matter what your role, I deputize you all as climate change communicators or climate change educators. And in the title of tonight's session is the implication that this is what I'd do if there was only one lesson that I'd teach on climate change. And of course, one lesson isn't enough. But it's hoped that it's a foot in the door, and the foot in the door technique is a real thing to help nudge change. So again, I'm going to ask you to carry this forward and carry it to perhaps carry some of the ideas here to your colleagues, and not just in the sciences, across the disciplines, because climate change, understanding climate change deeply requires understanding more than just the science. And it's also worth noting that using italics sparingly can help convey urgency. So there's thousands of decisions that go into the design of a lesson. I've probably identified scores of them tonight. I don't know quite how many. The key ideas that I'm going to focus on have some characteristics that I hope we think about when we're designing instruction, and those key ideas are true, important, and sticky. And I'll say otherwise, what's the point? But as I think Bryce will actually say on Thursday, there is some point to going beyond what people are going to hold on to. But I think that for the durable ideas that you want people to retain, you want to really think about what's true, important, and sticky. I'll also throw in a little bit of education-ese. The anchor phenomenon for this lesson is exploring what happens to a gallon of gasoline after it's put into a gas tank. And if you want to look at anchor phenomenon, there's a link from the presentation to a good sort of checklist for anchor phenomenon. I've got some starting assumptions, and because I'm assuming about some of this about you, I won't go into too much depth about it. Most Americans are concerned about climate change, and many, if not most of them, know it's real, it's us, it's a serious problem, and we can do things to make it less bad. Very importantly, most Americans don't know that most Americans feel this way. And most Americans don't know that most Americans want climate change taught better and more in schooling at whatever level. It's obviously not every American, but it's the majority in both political parties. And that's a really, really important idea that most folks don't know. So please spread the word on that. And there's, again, links to that article in the presentation. So that is sharing that is a bit of, it's effectively peer pressure. Again, a little bit of academic language. Social proof is if other people think the way that you, other people are doing, that generally think the way you think or act, are doing something, then you're more likely to do it. And again, most Americans don't know that most Americans want more climate change taught, so get that word out. Another important starting assumption is that scientific accuracy and good explanations are essential, but they are not sufficient for changing someone's minds. So we've got to do other things beyond the explanation. Coherent storytelling helps with that. Hopefully I'll be coherent tonight. And the most important thing that we and our students can do right now about climate change is talk about it. Students are effective educators, particularly daughters are effective at educating their parents and grandparents about climate change. And I think that's an interesting and important idea. Another idea that I didn't work into formal slides quite as much as I intended to, but I think it's really important to talk more about fire in climate education efforts than we do right now. Almost everyone has some familiarity with fire. Most people don't really have a very good idea of what greenhouse gases are, especially if we start talking GHG and methane and carbon dioxide. That kind of goes over people's heads, but if we connect it to fire more explicitly, then I think we've got a better chance of making a difference. And there are billions of fires burning on Earth right now because of us. And most of those are controlled fires and furnaces and hot water heaters and stoves and kitchen fires and factories and power plants and so on. And under the hood of most cars, I've got an electric car 30 feet behind me or something like that in my garage. But I think we ought to talk more about fire, and we'll get to some of that today. It's also, I think, very worthwhile to recognize that climate change is hugely interdisciplinary and really can only be deeply understood from a systems perspectives. And schools are historically not very good at teaching systems perspectives or using interdisciplinary approaches. I hope we can change that over time. There's some resources for doing that, again, linked from the presentation. Some other assumptions will be brought up as we go, and I'm almost certainly trying to do too much in my allotted time, but there's artifacts left behind that you can refer to if I spark the right interest in you. And
Don,
yep.
Sorry to interrupt, but there was a question in the chat.
Sure. Let me take a peek. No, I don't mean wildfire. That's a good question. I don't at least mostly mean wildfire. I am talking about, when I say that there are billions of fires burning on Earth right now, there are not billions of wildfires. There are billions of fires burning in furnaces and factories. They're controlled fires under human control, and humans are interesting in that we are the only species with dominion over fire. There are other species that use fire, but I am talking specifically about the controlled fires in power plants and furnaces and water heaters and factories and everywhere that's using fire to meet a human end. And then, of course, there are also wildfires on top of that, but they pale in comparison by number to the number of fires that are under human control. And that's one of the things that I think will astonish you and scare you is sort of processing the meaning of all of those fires burning. But I do also want to give some hope and motivation to act. I'm going to astonish you and scare you as we go. And added to this presentation from the one that I've given many times in the past is more explanation about why I want to do those things. And we're going to focus on one kind of source of carbon dioxide, and that's gasoline. In the US, we burned 369 million gallons of gasoline on the average day in 2021. It's actually dropped a tiny bit, I believe, in 2022. And that's partly because of more electric vehicles coming online and more efficient vehicles also. But in any case, it's more than a gallon per person per day. I think we're up to about 340 million Americans. So it's a little over a gallon per person per day. And that should make you say, wow. And I'm going to throw around some big numbers. Oh, and I'm just remembering I forgot to set up a thing. So we'll just talk through one piece of this. And I'll ask that you take an imaginary sticky note and put a billion on it. And there's a number line going from 0 to 1 trillion. And if we were in a room together, I'd ask you to place your sticky note where it goes on the wall between 0 and 1 trillion. And I put a Post-it note with 0 in one corner of the room and a Post-it note on the other front corner of the front wall with 1 trillion on it, and ask folks to come up and put 1 billion where they think it goes. And I do have an online way of doing that, but I forgot to turn it on. So we'll just kind of talk through this piece and do this in your mind's eye and sort of point to the screen where you think 1 billion goes between 0 and 1 million. And in looking at that, your sticker should go very, 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 very close to the 0. Everything. So if we put up 1,000, 1 million, 1 billion, and 1 trillion, and I ask you to put all of those except 1 trillion up between 0 and 1 trillion, all of those things would go between, or in the first 1/1000th of the distance between 0 and 1 trillion, because 1 trillion is 1,000 billion, 1 million is 1,000 million, and 1 million is 1,000 thousand. And most of us don't have a good understanding of that, or a real sort of internalized understanding of that. And for most of human history, it hasn't mattered, but now it does. And I really think that in order for folks to meet their civic responsibilities, they need to know the difference between 1,000, 1 million, 1 billion, and 1 trillion. Before I was born in 1963, I'm old now, but before I was born, almost no one needed to understand that. And that means that, I think that means that it's not really in our evolutionary programming to be able to easily understand that. So we have to work hard at understanding scale. And the reality is most folks don't, and we can see that in these typical responses that, there we go. So there's a set of typical responses from another workshop spread out 2/3 of the way across the line or something like that. That was with a group of college students for an Earth Day presentation a year or two ago. But it hardly matters what group I do that with. The answers tend to look pretty much the same. And that matters for understanding that 369 million gallons of gas we're burning a day, understanding what it means that there are 340 billion Americans, or I'm sorry, 340 million Americans, and I think we crossed 8 billion humans this year. Is that right, or last year? So understanding what those numbers mean, you got to understand the difference between 1,000, 1 million, 1 billion, and 1 trillion. And there are strategies for doing that. One good one is talking about seconds, which people are familiar with time. So 1,000 seconds is about 17 minutes. 1 million seconds is about 12 days. That's 1,000 times 17 minutes. 1,000 times 12 days gets you to 32 years. And 1,000 times that gets you to 32,000 years. So 1 trillion seconds is only 32,000 years. That's a lot of seconds. And Homo sapiens, us, we've only been around for less than 10 trillion seconds. So Homo sapiens as a species is 300,000 years old or so. So somewhere in the ballpark of 10 trillion seconds for the existence of our species. And that's, if you stop and think about the implications of these numbers, it's really pretty mind-blowing. And it's an example of social math. Social math is described as the practice of making large numbers comprehensible and compelling by making some kind of comparison to social context that people understand. So there'll be other examples coming up in the talk later, but there was the first one, and there's a reference for social math. And now back to our regularly scheduled programming. So there's the last white slide we saw. We burn 369 millions of gallons of gas on the average day. And we want to think about where it goes. And to think about that, it's helpful again to get some sort of concrete feeling for it. And if we were live in person, I'd pass around this gallon jug that's 3/4 full of water. I don't like to pass around gasoline, and gasoline has a density about 3/4 of that of water. So If I fill up a gallon jug, 3/4 full of water, that gives you a feel for what a gallon of gasoline is like, and an image. And it weighs a little over 6 pounds, like I said, which means that if you're using 10 gallons a week, 60 pounds of gasoline seemingly disappears from your gas tank. And that's our anchor phenomenon, if we want to use that educationese. We know that it, of course, does not actually disappear. We know that matter can neither be neither created nor destroyed, only changed in form. Middle school science there. And in order to figure out what's happening with it, it helps to know what it is. And gasoline is a complex mixture of hydrocarbons. Those are chemical compounds made of hydrogen and carbon. It varies, the formula varies seasonally and geographically, and sometimes it's got ethanol in it and sometimes it doesn't, and so forth. But on average, its chemical formula is pretty close to C8H18, and that is the chemical octane, which you've probably seen on gas pumps before. And what do you get when you burn octane? Well, you get carbon dioxide and water and energy, of course. That's why you're doing it. And looking at, again, noting that I prefer to use Keynote for putting this stuff together, which is an Apple product that's their answer to PowerPoint. And I think the animations are easier to do, and we're going to look at one of those right now. So here's a cartoon of the combustion reaction for octane. And in our cartoon here, we've got some oxygen diatoms or oxygen molecules. We've got an octane molecule, and we give it a spark and things recombine. And so now we've gone from one octane molecule and 12.5 oxygen diatoms to having 8 carbon dioxide molecules, and there's those guys, and 9 water molecules. And when we look at those 8 carbon dioxide molecules, they weigh a bunch more than the octane molecule we started with. And there's the math. If you want to get into the technical chemistry, depending on what class you're teaching, you can get pretty much as technical as you want to. But that means that the resulting carbon dioxide and water weigh more than the gasoline we started with. Not magic. It's because we took oxygen from the air, not just the gasoline, but we end up with 19 pounds of carbon dioxide from burning 6 pounds of gasoline. And I think that should make you say, wow, especially when you remember that we're doing that 369 million times a day. That's pretty surprising for almost anybody. And it's just one of the surprises that we'll talk about tonight. And there's an interesting book on the power of surprise, and surprise as an educational tool. Surprise is fundamental to belief change. And we can, as educators, and we should, as educators, engineer surprise and be strategic about it. Probably most of you have done that fairly regularly here and there across your curricula. And surprise generally indicates either danger or opportunity or both. And I think in the case of the surprises that we're looking at tonight, it's both. It's clearly some dangers we're mostly talking about, and understanding those dangers and the nature of the surprise and figuring out how to talk about the surprise is an opportunity for us as educators. And I think we'll have some discussion time, but one of the questions that you might talk about in our discussion time is how you employ surprise, and also what surprises have led to changes in belief for you. And more surprises will follow. And there's a link to an interview with the author, which is quite interesting. So back to our regularly scheduled programming. There again is our 6 pound gallon of gasoline that yields 19 pounds of carbon dioxide. And now we want to think about that invisible gas that we're talking about, which is really pretty hard to wrap our heads around. What is 19 pounds of an invisible gas like. And where did my next prop go? I think my cat may have moved it on me. But I've got one. And so we're gonna, if we were live in person, and it wasn't a pandemic of an airborne pathogen, I would pass out balloons and have you think about those balloons and use that to picture a gallon of carbon dioxide. So how many gallon-sized balloons would it take to hold 19 pounds of carbon dioxide? So if we were live in person, I would hand you a balloon and have you think about it, hold it empty, think about how much it weighs, and then fill it up to about a gallon size. So I will do that. So that looks like about a gallon size balloon there. So I'll tie it off. And I'll think about how much it weighs now compared to how much it weighed when it was empty, and ask you to do that in your mind's eye, and you're using your imagination and holding that in your imagining holding that full balloon in your hand, and think about how much it weighs compared to how much it weighed when it was empty. It certainly doesn't weigh very much. Thinking about some things that weigh about 19 pounds. The larger of my two cats, you may have seen my smaller cat just climbing on me. My larger cat over there is about 19 pounds and lazy. A 20-pound bag of anything's, the right ballpark. A 1-year-old child's maybe 19 pounds. And you can probably think, the heaviest bowling ball is in that ballpark. So how many balloons, gallon-sized balloons, do you think it takes to hold 19 pounds of CO2? And why don't we actually have you put some stabs at that into the chat? So how many balloons would it take to hold 19 pounds of CO2? And of course, you have to subtract the weight of the balloon itself and just think about the stuff inside the balloon. And Luann's got a guess. Anybody else? Let's have at least a couple before I spill the beans. Got two pretty different guesses. And a third. Let's have one more, and then I'll spill the beans. Some of you are pretty close. It is about 1,100. So those of you in the ballpark of 1,000 are about right. If we have 20 people here tonight, which is actually exactly how many we have, that would mean we'd each have to fill up 55 balloons to get to that 1,100 balloons. And that would tire me out. That's a lot of balloons. And again, to help visualize, help wrap your heads around it, some more social math here. There's 100 balloons. So we need to do that 10 more times to get to 1,100. So there's 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900, 1,000, and 1,100 balloons from burning 1 gallon of gasoline. And you can also do the math to think about figure out how many balloons worth of oxygen it took to provide the reactant along with the octane. But man, that's a lot. And you should be saying, wow, to yourself right now. And that's the basics of the chemistry of combustion. And we do that 369 million times a day. That's over 7 billion pounds of carbon dioxide. And you can multiply 369 million times 1,100 balloons to figure out how many balloons of CO2 that would create. That's a lot. And that is scary stuff. You should right now be scared and astonished. And if we are honest about climate change, we will scare people. And we should be cognizant of that. And we should recognize that being upset about climate change is both rational and necessary if we're going to act. If we didn't get scared, we wouldn't do anything. And that's an idea that is going to pop up again and again in the next several slides. I didn't put any commentary on the slides about strategic repetition, but there's a fair amount of it in what I'm talking about tonight. And hopefully it's not repetition in a way that bores you, but in a way that drives points home. And I think, if we don't raise people's hackles to some degree, they won't care. A couple of slides on emotions, honesty, and activism. We have a moral obligation to be honest in our instruction and to neither lie nor hide the truth. And in this case, honesty evokes negative emotions. And that's not a horrible thing. If there are horrible things to learn about that are important, we're going to make people sad and anxious and depressed in a short-term way, not necessarily in a clinical way, hopefully not in a clinical way. And the best way to address anxiety and depression and so forth, those negative emotions, is to address the source of the anxiety, to work on the problem. So we have to nurture that climate action, or we will be either intentionally or unintentionally heightening the anxiety rather than alleviating it. And if we can work in community, that further reduces the anxiety. If we work together with people on these problems, we'll do better. And virtually everyone understands at some level that learning about bad things in history and in the modern world is fundamental to a good education. There's not a happy way to teach about the Holocaust, for example, or slavery. Does that mean we shouldn't teach about those things? No, of course we shouldn't. We have to, unless we want to live through them again. Such teachings are also integral to most religious traditions. And if you want to dig into that more, see the resources related to fire and brimstone in Fort McMurray, which is also included in our teacher-friendly guide to climate change, which is a resource that's free on our website. Full text is available on the website. We can get you a copy of the book if you want a hard copy. And I think it's really a pretty important idea to not be afraid of fear. I know hundreds of people working in climate change education or research, and every single one of them is scared. And that's at least a piece of why they are doing this work. And so I get pretty irritated when people say, don't scare people when you're teaching. I think that's really pretty horribly misguided. But that doesn't mean we should paralyze people with fear. It doesn't mean that scary things are the only things we ought to talk about. But we should recognize that fear changes history. A really good, rich example of that is after watching the 1983 television nuclear Armageddon film the day after, President Reagan wrote in his journal that he had to do whatever he could to assure that there is never a nuclear war, and he got right to work on that. So he did it because he was scared, and I think there are so many examples of that throughout our history. So now back to our regularly scheduled programming. Here we are back to our block of graphite, and there's our question again, and here's our block. Here's the real block of graphite in that picture. So do you think this is a lot more, a lot less, or about the same as the amount of carbon in a gallon of gas? And you can go ahead and say less, same, or more in the chat, and I will wait until folks respond. And we've got a couple of responses. I'll take a sip of my water. I'm going to hold out until there are at least a couple more. There we go. Okay. So we've got all of the possible answers in the chat, and I think about equally split. So let's see. So a gallon of gasoline is about 87% carbon by weight. If you, picture that octane molecule, you can kind of see that. That means there's 5.5 pounds of carbon in a gallon of gas. And again, pure graphite is pure carbon. There's our quarter to show scale on there. And the block is not big enough. I meant to order a 6 by 6 by 2 inch block, and I ordered a 2 by 2 by 6 inch blocks. So oops. So it actually would look like that. This is about 1/3 of the amount of carbon in a gallon of gasoline. And that means that every gallon of gasoline that we burn, puts out 3 times this much carbon out of the tailpipe. And we're doing that 369 million times a day in the United States. And that's about 1/4 of US carbon emissions. And if we think that is not changing the environment, well, that's pretty hard to reconcile, I think. And I think that if we can, bring people's attention to 3 times this much carbon in a gallon of gasoline going out your tailpipe every time you burn a gallon of gasoline, and it's pretty hard to deny that that's going to have some negative impacts on the environment. And so, oops, I can't see my stuff because I got you at the bottom. And now, thinking about if you want to take that carbon back out of the air, and it's really important, and I probably haven't strategically repeated this enough yet tonight, maybe I haven't said it at all. The most important thing you can do is not put it into the air in the first place. But if you get it into the air, well, we've been doing that since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution in earnest, and we've got to figure out how to. It would be good, I shouldn't say we've got to. It would be good to figure out how to take a lot of that carbon that we've been pumping into the atmosphere for a couple of 100 years back out. Technologically, the simplest thing to do is to plant plants. And thinking about wood specifically, well, wood's about 45 to 50% carbon. So if there's 5.5 pounds of carbon in a gallon of gasoline, and wood, to make the math easier, we'll say wood is 50% carbon, that means you need to grow 11 pounds of wood to take that carbon from a gallon of gasoline back out of the air. And I use the word sequester there, which is not a very commonly used word, and except for when talking about climate change, I think, and juries, I guess. But we've got to sequester that, and that means, part of what that means is we can't let it burn or decay. So we've got to grow 11 pounds of wood and leave it be in some way, shape, or forms, and protect it so it doesn't either rot or decay or burn. And thinking about what that means, as for one thing, that means, wow, that's a lot of wood. And to get, again, the social math picture on it, 11 pounds of wood, what does that look like? Well, just so happens a standard 8-foot 2x4 like this one, probably the most common piece of lumber sold in the US. I don't know if that's actually true, but it's certainly one that you can find in any Lowe's or Home Depot or lumber yard or whatever. And mine happens to say on it that it has about the same amount of carbon as a gallon of gasoline does. So you got to grow a 2x4, an 8-foot 2x4 for every gallon of gasoline, if that's the solution to deal with how much carbon we're putting into the air from gasoline. And so there's me with my 8-foot 2x4. 369 million times a day means 369 million 2x4s a day. And guess what? We're not doing anything remotely similar to that. And we really can't. That would require like doubling the amount of forest in the US in a year. And we'd have to do that all the time. And that's not going to work out. So we've got to figure out some other way than growing 1.5 trillion pounds of wood a year. And so again, I'm at a point where you should be scared. And I'm going to pause and look at some interesting graphs, having scared you a little bit more, and we'll talk more about scaring in a minute or two. I'm actually doing pretty well on time. That's good. So here's what I think is a fascinating graph, and we're a small enough crowd that I think you can unmute yourself and use the raise your hand thing, so I'll see you, and think about how this graph is relevant to your discipline or just how it's interesting. So it's a monthly look at gasoline consumption starting in I can't see it because of the from about 1945 to 2020. And something a little weird with my presentation just happened, where it put in the annual average line, which I'm a little puzzled by, a little surprised by. But raise your hand, give me or put in the chat what you think is interesting about that graph, or how it's relevant to your discipline. Yeah, so you can see the pandemic on there. Holy cow, can you see the pandemic on there? And it looks like the Keeling graph, which the Keeling graph is on the back cover of the Teacher-Friendly Guide to Climate Change. It does look like the Keeling graph. And let's click through to the online, and you can also see the 1970s gas crisis, the OPEC oil crisis, and we have increased consumption since 1980 because we like big trucks. And let's click through to the online version of this. And I'm puzzled by why that smoothed out line of the annual stuff is showing up. There it goes. So on this page, we want to scroll down to motor gasoline, and it's finished motor gasoline is what we want, and we click on this to get the graph from 1981 to 2022. And you can, and this is kind of squished at a different scale than the one that I downloaded was. So it's less obvious to see some of that change over time. One of the interesting things is, there is April of 2020, when we used a whole lot less gasoline all of a sudden. And the trough months are typically February's, and the peak months when we do most of our driving is July or August. And there's lots of interesting things that you can do with this graph. One of which I think is, point out to the social studies teacher that world events show up in what we do with our energy resources. We'll flip back over to the presentation here. And I think it's interesting to look at how the graph looks differently when you smooth it, instead of using annual averages rather than monthly averages. And you can think about that. And changing gears a little bit again, it's worth knowing there is good news in the climate change world. Carbon emissions from electric power generation in the US, I forgot to include that this is for the US, has fallen 40% since 2005. That's really, really pretty incredible. And I think that's some really good news that almost no one knows. And there's a lot sort of behind that story of why electric power generation has fallen so much in the last 18 years. What are some contributors to that? Folks want to either put it in the chat or raise their hands and speak up. Why do you think carbon emissions from electric power generation and renewables is a piece of the puzzle? Less coal burned is probably the biggest piece of the puzzle. Lower cost of solar and wind. Wind more than solar so far. Right now, I believe Oklahoma gets 40% of its electricity from wind, which is a huge, huge change in 15 years ago. They got less than 2%, I think, and now they're getting 40%. And other states across the Midwest are seeing similar changes. And that plus fracking, which is interesting, has led to the shutdown of a huge number of coal-fired power plants, and nobody's going to build. It doesn't look like there's going to be any substantial new coal-fired power plants built in the US or really pretty much anywhere else in the world. They're not economical anymore, and that's awesome news. Do we anticipate a problem as solar panels begin to fail? Not really. They won't fail all at once, and their productivity gradually degrades over time, but they last for a very long time with very low maintenance, and then you make more. And hopefully you can do that with green energy. They are difficult to recycle right now, but that hopefully will change. And they do last a pretty good long time. Another piece of good-ish news, but I would say complicated, is that more than 5% of the cars sold in the last year in the US and more than 10% of those globally were electric vehicles. That's, like I said, good news-ish. Really, as we think about how to make cars more efficient and less carbon intensive, we also need to figure out how to we need to think at least as much about making a transportation system more efficient than cars as we do about making cars more efficient. We really need to move away from the individual, everybody's got their own car kind of thinking, and that does not mean a deterioration of quality of life. There are lots of real advantages to making communities more bikeable and walkable and so forth, and improving mass transit in lots of ways. So lots of things there, but that's good-ish news, like I said. But we need to be careful with good news. And that's partly because good news and over-focus on good news can reduce motivation for action. And I think the reasons for that are pretty obvious. If you hear lots and lots of good news about how systems are changing, that means that you might not need to do anything. That is not the case. So looking at another piece of good news here, carbon emissions in some nations are substantially down over the last couple of decades. I think that's going back to 2005. And, that's great. But here's carbon emissions, global carbon emissions over that similar period of time. And that totally overwhelms those specific industrialized countries we took a peek at. That doesn't mean those countries shouldn't do their very best, and we shouldn't continue working on reducing our carbon emissions here. We got to help the rest of the world do that too, and there's reason to think that we'll make progress on that, in part because renewables are cheaper now than building more traditional energy sources. And I am again surprised by these graphs drawing smooth lines on top of them. I didn't do that. I didn't anticipate that. I guess that came with the downloaded. I guess I downloaded a GIF instead of a image. And back to an early slide, hopefully tonight's key ideas are true, important, and sticky. And just saying a tiny bit more about that, dishonesty is just not okay, even if the motive is to protect. Dishonesty also tends to be transparent, at least in the long term. So you might fool people for a little while, but Mother Nature kind of gives us a dope slap. The ideas have to be important, and you should be able to pretty easily answer the question, why do we have to learn this stuff? And the ideas have to be sticky. They need to have the potential to lead to durable understandings that last far beyond the lesson. And some of you have heard one of my favorite quotes from Don Weinshank, a professor I worked with when I was in grad school at Michigan State, was fond of saying that 90% of your students forget 90% of the content of your course within 90 days of finishing the course. And I think that sums up a lot of educational research in a pretty concise way. And that's got a couple of implications with it. One is think very, very carefully about the 10% that they do hold on to. And another is to think about how to make it so that that statement's not true anymore. And then there's some more stuff there that I could continue on, but I'm not going to. And I'm going to flip back over to the agenda, I think. And this is now the discussion time-ish. Just so I know what time it is, 7:54. So I've got in the agenda the possibility of breaking into groups and talking about some of these things, including some ideas that might emerge in addition to the three that I suggest. The three I suggest are talking about surprises, talking about addressing negative emotions, or talking about action, and then the opportunity to design your own topic. I think I'm inclined to just kind of open it up for general discussion. So we'll see how that goes. If there isn't much general discussion, then I'll have you go into breakout rooms and pick those different topics. So questions, comments, thoughts? Bryce has unmuted himself.
Hi, Don. Could you tell me again the title of the book about surprise?
Yep.
It was 3 words, but I forget what the first 2 were.
Sure. So it is, and I'll put a link actually to the Amazon page for it. It's The Power of Surprise, How Your Brain Secretly Changes Your Belief. Put a link, put it in the chat.
Yeah, you know, I've always seen the similarity between surprise, which I agree is a powerful technique. I've always used it, but the parallel to humor, because humor depends on surprise, and it also catches your attention.
That's
in
right.
fact, you know, I would at least in advanced courses, I'd in some cases literally deliberately try to lead students down the merry wrong path,
Right.
So they're thinking, okay, well, that's so obvious. This is where it's going to be. Then I point out, well, wait a second now. Uh, it can't be so because that's not compatible with some direct observations, and then basically clear that up. But the
Right.
surprise there, I mean, I don't do it to embarrass anybody, of course. I mean, this is not the point. Again, we're talking about small groups of 5 or 10 in the class.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think that's very important. I think the use of surprise, you can't do it all the time, of course,
Right. Yeah, you
and
can't do it all the time.
but you know, again, tastefully.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing is, so we've spent an hour so far talking about gasoline, and I did it way too fast for deep understanding. I think if you find the right surprises, you can then spend a long time unpacking them. So you're not necessarily going to be providing new surprises every day, and it's not part of all instruction. But I think it can be a really important and really valuable piece. And I've actually been thinking on how to generate epiphanies for a long time, and I think surprise is part of that. I see a comment from Luann, and it's nice to see Luann here. Good to see Luann in the chat. But it's a comment, not a question. Are there other questions or comments? Ingrid.
Yeah, I wanted to mention one surprise that I learned about a year or two ago, and this was reading in one of the reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they pointed out that scientists can measure the level of oxygen in the atmosphere, and they've seen that it's been decreasing over time. And this should be obvious based on what you showed us, that when we burn fossil fuels, it uses up oxygen from the atmosphere. But I hadn't made that connection in my mind. And when I read that and thought about that oxygen that's being used up, that's O2 molecules, that's oxygen we breathe. And it's decreasing in the atmosphere. Now, if you look into this pretty quickly, you'll see that it's decreasing by a very small amount. Like there's no threat to our health. We're not going to suffocate.
Right.
But when you first read it, you first learn about this, it is surprising. It kind of makes you think, oh, are we all going to suffocate?
Right.
So it's I think that was a useful surprise for me. And it does connect again to thinking about combustion and the processes that you talked about and how it's connections with human life.
Yeah, and another one of my favorite surprises that I haven't mentioned yet tonight, that in a way should not have been a surprise to me, but when we were writing, and both Ingrid and Rob and Alex, who I mentioned, who is not here because it's midnight in Paris, are the co-authors of the Teacher-Friendly Guide to Climate Change, which was published in 2017. But when we were writing that is when I realized that for 90% of Earth history, there was no fire. Because in order to have fire, you need to have dry fuel, you need to have enough oxygen, you need to have heat, and you need to have a sustained combustion reaction, a sustained chemical reaction. And 2 out of 4 of those things weren't there until about 460 million years ago, when the first plant life on land emerged, and the oxygen levels got high enough for there to be fire. And now fire is at the root of modern climate change. And of course, many people, when talking about climate change, say, well, climate's been changing for all of Earth history. And if you point out to them, well, yeah, but for 90% of Earth history, there was no fire, and climate change is changing now because of fire, mostly, not only because of fire, but primarily because of fire. That kind of shoots a hole in their argument, which may or may not work. As noted, a good explanation, good evidence is not enough to change people's minds, but it sure helps. And it's I think part of the equation. And I saw Solomon unmute himself, but he's muted again. Did you have a question? maybe not. Nope. Okay. Yes, and Solomon points out, without fire, we wouldn't have modern society. We wouldn't be human without fire. As I said, fire humans are the only species that have dominion over fire, and some proto-humans had some control of fire before Homo sapiens came along, but it's going back about 1 million years out of the Earth's 4.5 billion year history, where there were primates who could do something with fire, and they gained and lost the control of fire. It looks like in the human record a few times over time as climates got wetter, and they initially learned how to control, to keep a fire, but not start a fire. And it took a long time to learn how to start a fire. And that's a pretty important event in our ancient history, but not so ancient as, billions or millions of years ago. Other questions? Comments?
Don?
Oh, yes, the presentation is being recorded. We're live on YouTube as we speak, and I will add the link to that to the agenda. But you can find it on the PRI YouTube channel, which is I think is at the bottom of the agenda. If you scroll down to the bottom of the agenda, you'll see that link. And like I said, I will add that's to the YouTube channel. And if you look at the live stream, you'll find it pretty quickly, but I'll add to the agenda the direct link to the video. And I think I saw Deb put a hand up. And maybe it was just asking that question.
Just clapping.
Okay. Yes, I saw the thing in the corner when I was looking too many places at once to see if it was a hand raised or an applaud. Ingrid?
Yeah, I had another question. So you mentioned that in teaching that things should be true and important and sticky. What do you think are some good strategies for making things stick?
That's a good question. And there's a book by that name that or Making Ideas Stick, I think is the name of the book, that looks into that, which of course, off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact recommendations from it, but generally you make it relevant to people's lives. And that often means looking at local examples. So, one place to get local examples of energy information is the Energy Information Administration website, eaa.gov, and you can look and see, let's actually pull that up quickly. And I will screen share again here. So here's the link that I'm looking at. And this website is really pretty cool. You can click on any state and get an incredible wealth of information about the energy system in that state. And it's not cooperating. It's doing something. Different state. Better. Oh no. Just that. Is that right? I am disappointed that it's not working. That's the first time that's happened. Oh, let me go back there for a second and try the pull down menu at the top instead. So I think the lion's share of the folks here are in New York. So there's this interactive map that has all of the major energy infrastructure in the US, and it's clickable, and you can get data on that. We'll come back up to that in a minute. But it's got a series of quick facts about whatever state you're looking at. And you can see some interesting things about New York's energy system. Nuclear power is 25% of our electric generation in 2021, and so forth. And then down here, you can see consumption by source. And a question I like to ask, because, and Bryce was talking about this earlier, sort of asking questions that sort of misguide people a little bit, or they're going to get wrong. A question I like to ask is, identify the 2 or 3 or 4 biggest energy sources in your state, and put them in order. And for the most part, people don't know, although in states that are energy producers like Texas and Oklahoma and such, they're better at it than in places like New York State, where we don't have a lot of extraction industries. But most people are pretty surprised that there is no coal, and this is 2020 data. For the most part, people don't know.
Could I just interrupt? There's an
Sure.
echo happening, and I think it might be Bryce's mic.
Oh, okay. I will mute Bryce.
From someplace.
Yep. No, it's not Bryce.
No, I was on mute.
Yeah, it's not Bryce, but is it gone? Seems like it's gone, maybe. So many people are surprised that there's essentially no coal, and indeed, this is from 2020, and in I think February of 2020 was when the last coal-fired power plant in New York State shut down. So we're now down to 0 coal in New York State, and many people think it's one of the top 2 sources of energy in the state, and it's not in the top 10. And natural gas gives us twice as much energy as the second biggest thing, which is gasoline. And you can look at just electricity. And again, if you ask people about where the electric power in their state is coming from, for the most part, they don't know. And asking good questions that that people don't know the answer to and find the answer surprising, that's likely to be sticky. And going to Lisa's question about the slides for the talk, up here in the agenda is that word here. Oops, that's not the right one. Oh dear. Oh yes, it is. So when you click on that and go to that site, it initially brings you to the top of the document, and if you wait just a second, it'll pop down to within this document, where does gasoline go? And the teacher's edition that we shared tonight is here. So the presentation that I used is this first sub-bullet down here. I made a PowerPoint by exporting from Keynote. There might be some quirkiness with some of the animations in that. I haven't tested it because I just finished the presentation this afternoon, but I did make sure they worked in the student version. So where does gasoline go? PowerPoint up here, the animations will work in this one, and this is the presentation that I shared tonight. And the agenda again. Let's see, do I still have that in? Nope, right there. Let me put the agenda link in the chat again. And it's also in the email I sent this afternoon. But I will put it in the chat. There is the agenda. And the agenda links to, I think, all of the stuff. Oops, I'm sorry. I was not in the agenda when I copied that link. So that's the link to that document with the interdisciplinary resources, including the talk. And here now is the agenda document. And let's see. So that should give you all the goodies you need. And other questions, things you want to look at? If you don't have questions, I have questions for you.
I just had a comment, Don. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So for me, what's sticky about, like, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I find what's sticky about it is how concrete
Yes.
and you make the experience. That, to me, you walk away from that and you can't get that image of the balloons out of your mind. That's sticky. I mean, so it's a start. It's a sticky start, but I think that the other, where it leaves off is, so what? Like, if kids don't really understand the implication of CO2 in the atmosphere, that's like a whole nother
That's right.
lesson, right?
And it's probably more than a single lesson to get at the mechanisms by which global warming works.
Right.
So this, as I said in the beginning, is kind of the foot in the door lesson. It's the kickoff. It is certainly, and also very importantly, as I said, the title of the talk is "If I Only Had One Lesson to Teach About Climate Change" or something like that. And that shouldn't be the case. So yes, getting into the mechanics of how greenhouse gases work and what the greenhouse effect actually means, which is somewhat of a problematic metaphor for what's actually going on, but it has some utility, as every model is imperfect. But it's a reasonable starting point, I think. And we sometimes talk about thickening blankets rather than greenhouses as a way to understand it. But you're absolutely right that this is not the end of it.
And one problem that I find with my curriculum is I find I don't have enough time to fully address climate. I feel like there's so much that's packed in, and I don't know if the NGSS is going to change that so that we have more time. Does anybody know?
Is better, but it's still not enough. It does give more attention to it. And I was part of a meeting yesterday that I think maybe actually some of the younger folks on this call were there too, was young people talking to members of the Board of Regents in New York State and the Assistant Superintendent for Instruction or some such title. And talking about climate change education legislation to really push for more attention to climate change in K-12 schooling. But that's a complicated lift. Standards change remarkably slowly. The next generation science standards, I believe, were published in 2013. And there's murmurings of, what's going to be next after that, but they won't be at, whatever it is, won't be out for years. So that means that means probably 20 years between national standards documents or something like that. And the next generation science standards do pay more attention to climate than the standards that came before them. But it's still not enough in terms of what's explicit. But if you look at other aspects of what's in there, there are ways to pay attention to it in existing standards across all the disciplines. So if you look at that, I think it's in the interdisciplinary document. Let me make sure I'm speaking truth before I do that. I know I was looking at it earlier today. But the cross-cutting concepts and science and engineering practices do get at that. Let me see if I can find a good quick look at that somewhere. And it'll take a minute, but they talk about maps and models and are just sort of broad ideas that are infused across the standards. And I think those open the door for you to teach about climate, to highlight those concepts and approaches. But they don't say climate change explicitly necessarily. Excuse me. Here we are.
I have a question.
Yep, go ahead.
It's just such a wonderful presentation, and the visuals made it so sticky, and the numbers also were very helpful. Because sometimes somebody will say, oh, there's so much happening, or so many trees, or so much oxygen, and without seeing your visuals, that the perspective is very different. I wanted to follow up with Lisa's question. Have you ever seen an image of like, okay, there's like this much carbon in the air, or this, and there's this much happening, like visualizing the 1,000 balloons?
Oh yes, yeah.
On a larger scale. Have you ever seen something like, or the number of trees, the number of forests, like the bigger? Yeah,
there's some really beautiful graphics that I don't remember the name of the organization that puts those out, that does these animations or infographics of carbon. Ingrid or Rob, do you remember? Do you remember that?
No, I was anxiously awaiting to find out what it was.
It's out there. There are some beautiful examples of that, but I don't remember the name of the.
Okay, Ingrid put a link in the chat.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ingrid.
Yeah, it might be that you're thinking of,
Yeah,
I'm not sure, but they often use these big spheres filled with carbon compared to, if you go to that homepage, compared to the Statue of Liberty there.
Right, yes, that's
I don't know
exactly
if
what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, there you go. Yep, that's exactly what I was thinking of. So if you read the explanation of what we're looking at, that's a powerful site. And just flipping back to that earlier question, I will paste this into the end of the document, the agenda document. So this is the 3 dimensions of the next generation science standards. And it's sort of the big cross-cutting stuff from the very, very complex document that is the next generation science standards. But if you think about the science and engineering practices and the cross-cutting concepts, you can think of ways to teach those ideas while teaching about climate change, even if they don't say climate change, they don't shout it out, but engaging in argument from evidence, for example. Lots of ways to teach climate change when doing that, analyzing and interpreting data. All of these you can apply to teaching about climate change, and likewise with the cross-cutting concepts. So I just added this to the end of the agenda document, so you can explore that. And I think I have mixed feelings about the next generation science standards, the NGSS or New York's version of it, the New York State Science Learning Standards. They are the big document is very complex, but if you and I think too complex, but the big ideas within it, the science and engineering practices and the cross-cutting concepts, I think if we pay good attention to those, hopefully they'll get the specifics of details of the content. But if you focus on these practices and concepts, I think in your teaching you'll do a good job. And I think the similar things could be said across the disciplines, and it's worth noting that the National Council of Teachers of English have both a position statement on teaching climate change in the English classroom and a book on how to do that. There's a book by one of my grad school friends, James D'Amico, on teaching climate change in the social studies classroom that just came out this past fall. And I meant to say somewhere that one of the sticky things from that book for me was his change of language, and rather than talking about anthropogenic climate change or human-caused climate change, he refers to industry-led climate change. And I think that's a very nice, important change of vocabulary, because it really is, yes, we individuals can, turn down the thermostat in our houses and such, but really it's industry that has led our production of greenhouse gases, and figuring out how to move beyond that, I think, is a really important idea. And thinking about how we have been misled by industry is really important too. And Jenny's question, and hi Jenny, is so students see this lesson and are scared and worried enough that they want to take action. My question is, where do we go from here? How can they act on what they have learned? And I see Solomon is a student activist himself, and I think, Solomon, you were part of the meeting yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. And he has some good suggestions there. And Ingrid put in a link to Lynn Cherry's website, Young Voices for the Planet, which tells nice stories of students taking action and doing, one of my favorite examples of that is a group of middle school girls who got their district to reduce their carbon emissions, which also ended up reducing their energy costs and saving the district tens of thousands of dollars a year. Another good example is the Wild Center up in the Adirondacks has Youth Climate Action Summit Toolkit to help students organize climate action summits. And as I said, I think one of the most important things that we can do, and the young people that we work with can do, is talk more about climate change. So just getting out and talking to particularly leaders of industry and government leaders about taking action on climate is really, really valuable, and I think the most important thing we can do right now. So, I'll try to remember to add to the agenda that the link to the study that shows that daughters are good at convincing their dads to change their minds, their dads and granddads. I love that study. So that's a piece of the ideas there. And it is about our end point. There is a very brief feedback form at the bottom of the table that is the sort of formal agenda. If you click on that, that'll just take you a minute or two to do that. And I ask you to please do that. I'll copy that and put it in the chat. Excuse me. That is there. And I'm glad to stick around, but it is 8:27 and we said we were going to go till 8:30. So if you want to stick around and chat, I'm happy to do that. I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can see folks. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And I will add the link to the recording to the agenda probably tomorrow. So you'll be able to review, or if you came in late, you can catch the first little bit. Any other questions, comments, thoughts to share? Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Don.
Have a great night.
Good night.
Hi, how you doing? All right, it looks like folks are tuning out, so I'm going to click the end button. Thank you, one and all.